All right, eighth graders. Well, here we are. It is Mr. Mueller, Mrs. Deaver, and Mr. Sig, and we're going to be here, and we're going to spend the next maybe 20 minutes or so here talking through a lot of the different events and things that are going to be, you guys can expect to see on the test. So this here is just going to be kind of a discussion between the three of us to help you guys out as we walk through these things. So, woohoo, let's get started. All right. So I'm going to hit share screen here. And here we go. All right, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Awesome, cool. All right, so we're going to walk through kind of the events here leading up to the Civil War, and I thought we'd start with the Missouri Compromise. Why is the Missouri Compromise important in this debate as we're leading up to the Civil War, guys?
Well, I think it's the first time they really try to control the spread of slavery. I mean, these are new territories that are getting added in, and they do compromise, and most people agree, okay, as long as all the territory south of this is slave states and all the territory north can be free, then yeah, this will work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and from what I understand, the abolitionists later would feel like this was almost a sacred line. So when we see it disappear, they are not happy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the border is like that. It stops it from spreading. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So as a quick recap, just for the students, just as a recap here, the Missouri Compromise line, you can see it there on the map. It's in 1820, Missouri wants to come in as a slave state. It's going to upset the balance of power between free and slave states in the country. So in order to keep that balance equal in the Senate, a compromise is struck. Missouri is admitted as a slave state. Maine is admitted as a free state. And then that red line there is the line that's drawn that says for all future territory, everything north of that will be free territory and everything south will be slave territory. And that's essentially the compromise over slavery that's in effect for the next 30 years, right?
Yeah.
Now, it does only apply to the Louisiana Purchase, correct?
Correct. At that time, that's correct. Yep.
It does not keep going to the Pacific Ocean.
Well, the land to the Pacific Ocean, we didn't control or own yet.
Correct.
At the time of this, it just went to the edge of our territory.
Right.
Right.
But it will not apply to that new territory as we get it.
Right.
Right, but I think a lot of people assume that it will apply if we gain any territory, and that's where the argument really starts.
Exactly.
They want to see that line stay. You know, I think a lot of people have realized that getting rid of slavery is going to be really hard, but they can make sure it doesn't spread. That's the idea. You're going to stop it from growing.
You got it.
Yeah, and I think if you follow that line east to the Atlantic Ocean, you can see if you follow the red line up the Ohio River to Pennsylvania, and then what's called the Mason-Dixon line from Pennsylvania to the coast, and then look back at Missouri, it's almost like slavery is invading past this natural line.
Yeah.
And they thought, we can live with that invasion as long as nothing else ever crosses that line.
Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead then. Let's talk about the next kind of major compromise over slavery, and that's going to be the Compromise of 1850. So would anybody like to explain here in 1850 what's going on? Why does another compromise in Congress have to be reached in 1850?
Well, now we've gained a lot more land. We've gained Texas. We've gained California, the Oregon Territory. All those Mormon pioneers have all gone west, and they've settled in Utah. They're trying to become a state. There's people now down in the New Mexico Territory that are wanting to eventually become a state. And so we have this huge, huge amount of land that wants to join. And every time an area wants to join the nation, the issue of is it going to be a free state or a slave state comes up.
Right, exactly. And the big thing in 1850 really is what drives this compromise is that California, you see out there, wants to come in as this big, huge new free state in 1850, right? So obviously the slave states are opposed to adding this huge new state out on the West Coast unless they're going to get something in return for it. So kind of I think about it, there's kind of two pieces to the compromise. The first piece is California is going to get admitted as a free state. And then what the South gets in return is going to be that Fugitive Slave Act, the Fugitive Slave Law, which we can discuss here in a second. And then the second piece of that compromise is kind of those reddish territories for Utah and New Mexico. The idea of popular sovereignty really gets introduced here. Would anybody like to kind of explain what that means, the popular sovereignty idea?
Well, we started this term all the way back in the Constitution as a principle, which meant people have the power to decide for themselves.
Right.
In this case, it's the power to decide slavery.
Right. Yeah. So in this case, this idea of popular sovereignty, or the people in Utah or New Mexico, if they would eventually want to become states, the people there would get to vote to decide slavery. Now, we'll come back to this in just a second, but that whole idea of popular sovereignty doesn't really get put into place until the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. So we'll come back and talk about that in a second. But let's come back to the kind of one of those other major pieces of the Compromise of 1850, which is the Fugitive Slave Act. Would anybody kind of like to explain what was the Fugitive Slave Act? Why did the slave states like it? And why did it cause problems for northern states?
Well, the people in the North were not really excited about that law, because not only did it mean that any Black person in the North could be kidnapped or taken into custody and sold back into slavery or declared a slave or whatever, but they were also going to have to help. It was that law required them to turn in anyone that they found. And for abolitionists, or even for people who weren't so dedicated to the abolitionist cause, they just didn't want to be involved. It just really upset a lot of people that they were going to have to participate, that they could be deputized and have to participate in rounding up slaves.
Right.
But at the same time, I think what came first was the initial problem, which was runaway slaves, which is a problem for the South increasingly. You've got to keep in mind, Frederick Douglass wrote his famous narrative in 1845. So this idea of slaves escaping, I don't know when Harriet Tubman is active, but probably going way back to this time. And the Underground Railroad is getting stronger and stronger. And I think the South sees this as a fix to this problem of slaves escaping.
I think you're right, Christian, in terms of that. Yeah, the Underground Railroad is certainly alive and well when the Compromise of 1850 is passed. And, you know, it's hard to set a date on the Underground Railroad because it's active for decades and decades. You know,
Right.
we're mostly focusing on the 1850s here, but the Underground Railroad was certainly in effect before, you know, the 1850s roll around. And you can kind of see this map here just kind of gives you an idea of some of the various routes that runaway slaves would use to escape southern slave states. A lot of them into northern free states, and a lot of them made their way up into Canada or even out to sea, right? You can kind of see that too. So.
And that's the other thing. The Underground Railroad is, you know, it was against the law. So it was definitely hidden. There aren't a ton of records. We don't really know exactly when it started, and we don't really know how many people traveled on it or their exact locations, because they're just, people didn't write that stuff down. It could incriminate themselves.
Right. Yeah. And obviously, we've talked about Harriet Tubman. She's probably the most famous, conductor on the Underground Railroad. And, one of those kind of great examples of self-sacrifice and bravery of going back, almost 20 times or so, almost back down into the South to free slaves. So that's pretty remarkable. And then, Mr. Sig, you mentioned this here, Frederick Douglass. We'll come back to Uncle Tom's Cabin here in a second, but Frederick Douglass, he does write his famous autobiography in 1845. What do you guys think? I mean, specifically with Frederick Douglass, what do you think was significant about his role in the 1850s or even before that or leading up to the Civil War?
I think, I mean, there were a lot of escaped slaves, but I think the key must have been his personality. I think he had a personality that was very powerful. He could express himself with a lot of emotion, and he was very effective when he spoke and wrote at gaining people to the side of the abolitionists.
Mm-hmm. I think there's this perception that white people were superior to the Black people at the time. And that was reinforced by the fact that almost none of the slaves were allowed to be educated. And Frederick Douglass, I love that story that we read that was in our module that you shared with me, Ryan, mm-hmm. where he said he stole his education. He fought to be educated. And as he goes around and talks to people, it's not just his personality, but it's also the fact that he proves in person he is just as educated. He knows how to read. He knows how to write. There's nothing about his race that is making him inferior at all. I think his personality and the things that he says and the way that he speaks proves conclusively to people that it's the law that's keeping this whole group of people subservient, not anything natural to their race. And so he becomes this powerful speaker, and he helps change a lot of people's minds and their perceptions about whether or not Blacks should be free. Are they capable of being free, you know?
Yeah, I definitely think he's so articulate and well-spoken. I think you guys have both pointed that out. I mean, even when I think he meets with Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln becomes president, that becomes apparent too. And speaking of somebody who's also articulate and publishes something that's important, let's talk about the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is published in 1852, I believe. This book by, you can see there, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I'm sure both of you guys have had a chance to read this book too. And this book it's just such a powerful narrative describing the life of slavery, the life of slaves, what that would have been like in the South. Why do you think that this novel in particular had such a big impact on people in the North, kind of the abolitionist movement, or maybe even people who weren't involved with abolition? And why do you think there was such outrage against it in many Southern states?
Well, I think it was a unique piece of literature. If you read it, you'll realize that she's created this narrative where it's not just a novel about a story. She is present in the story, and she comes in and out as this narrator, talking to the audience. Which I found very interesting. And I don't know, maybe that was common back then, but what she does is uses it as a tool, almost probably as her father would have done, to teach Christianity and how that fits into the story. So it's very much like a sermon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She also, she just makes a huge appeal to people's emotions. I think there were a lot of people who were a little bit removed from the whole slavery issue, because there's a lot of people in the North that didn't own any slaves, didn't know anybody who owned slaves. There are even a lot of people in the South that don't own any slaves. And so they could legitimately say, well, it's not really my problem. But when they read this book, it's such a compelling story. It tugs on your heartstrings so much that people suddenly are feeling guilty or feeling bad that slavery exists in their country. It's connecting something that was not anything to do with them to their own emotions. And I think that connection just ramps up the focus on slavery.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. I think for a lot of, especially people in the North, I think a lot of people in the North had zero exposure to slavery. And I think for a lot of people, this was kind of their first real exposure to that. And the book just lays bare, I think, the horrors of slavery. And I think for a lot of people, it just sort of unshucked slavery in a way that had never been, prevalent to them before. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she meets Abraham Lincoln, is believed to have said, he says, "So you're the little lady that started this whole war." I mean, that's the kind of impact that Harriet Beecher Stowe's book had. It was one of the best-selling novels in the entire 19th century.
Right. I think the numbers say it all.
Yeah.
And the more I've looked into this to try to find information for our students, I keep coming across this idea that it's not a one-time read.
Yeah.
People kept this handy and were reading it over and over again, almost like the Bible itself.
Yeah. Yeah, this time period, people didn't own a whole lot of books. So if you purchased a book, you read it, you talked about it, you read it as a family, you loaned it to your friends, everybody talked about it. This was the big thing.
You got it.
The big entertainment thing of that decade, to read and discuss. And because it was such a hot political topic, it just, the influence of this book just was tremendous.
And I don't want to give anything away, but I guess I'm going to anyway, spoiler. What I find amazing with the book is it would be really satisfying for an abolitionist or people who hate slavery at the end of the book for something terrible to happen to the slave owner and something amazing to happen to our main character, Tom. But that's not what happens.
Right.
And she uses the ending as a tool, I think, to even make it more effective. Again, in line with her Christian beliefs. And I think that really, tips it to make it way more powerful than it could have been.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing, is she couches it as a moral issue, right? It's not purely an economic issue. Harriet Beecher Stowe says these are people, this is how they're being treated. It's a moral issue. It goes against God. And I think that is probably why it cuts through so deeply to a lot of people, because it really does make slavery a moral issue, right?
Well, and you have to know that even in the South, this book was being purchased and they were angry about it. They didn't, they still had, the book still affected their emotions, but a lot of people were really, really angry about it because they would read the book and feel like, well, this isn't how we treat our slaves. We're nice to our slaves. Our slaves get everything that they need. And this is unrealistic. And very few people are treated this way. But, so you can picture the emotional outrage from this book on both sides of the line, the North and the South. They both have this huge reaction and it sells out in both areas.
All right. Well, speaking of another sort of contentious political issue, let's talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed in 1854. So we'll go ahead and introduce our man from Illinois, Stephen Douglas here. So Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, is becoming a national figure at this point. He's the guy that really authors this bill here called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, mainly because he wants to get a railroad built through the North. That's his main motivation behind this. But
and he doesn't want to have to deal with the slavery issue. He's hoping to just put it off, not have to confront it.
Right. So what he does, Douglas puts in this bill, here he brings up this issue of popular sovereignty again. So in 1854, Kansas wants to come in as a state, and this is the first time where we see this. So in all the other instances here, we've seen Congress step in and say, you're a free state, you're a slave state, you're a free state, you're a slave state, right?
Yep.
In terms of what we've seen so far. But now it's going to be, okay, people of Kansas, you want to be a state? Okay, you get to go and vote on whether or not you want to allow slavery. So what happens here in Kansas, guys? Why has this become such an issue in 1854? On its face, it seems like that'd be a good thing, right? National government steps back from the deciding thing, lets the people there decide. But what happens here in Kansas? Why this is such a problem?
Yeah, think about our recent elections and all the talk about voter fraud and all of that kind of stuff. It would be so much worse at a time when their record keeping was just horrible, and it's a territory, so there's no way to prove who lived there and who wasn't. So everybody just swarms to Kansas. All the abolitionists and all the pro-slavery people, they come in and they all both sides try to rig the election. It's crazy.
Well, if you can highlight, Ryan, just so we can see it, that black line at the bottom, there's that sacred line.
Yep.
And it's been sacred for going all the way back to 1820. So most people's lifetimes. And now all of a sudden, with this law, and for no good reason, it just vanishes.
Yeah.
It's like having the rug pulled out from underneath you.
Right.
A sacred rug.
Yeah, now slavery is optional. They have the option to have slavery above that 1820 compromise line. And oh my goodness, it's like lighting everybody on fire, that whole topic.
Well, and as you mentioned, Priscilla, you've got people, they're called border ruffians, right? These people, these pro-slavery people that come in across the border from Missouri. You've got abolitionists that are coming in from the Northeast that are coming into Kansas to vote illegally. So you've got all of these people who aren't residents of Kansas coming in to vote. And there's these different territorial governments that get set up in different places in Kansas. Really for the next 7 years in Kansas, it's disputed on what is Kansas. Kansas eventually comes in 1861 as a free state. Too little, too late at that point. But, really, I think the thing that is probably the most, maybe the foreshadowing part of Kansas is the violence that unfolds there, right?
Yeah, bleeding Kansas, where the fighting actually does break out. I mean, people are dying over this issue of slavery in Kansas.
Right, so this is the first time I feel like we really see pro-slavery and anti-slavery people killing each other, over the issue of slavery. And probably no one's more notorious there than this gentleman right here, right? Brown, who we can talk about. I thought this might be a good segue into him, and then we can come back and finish up with a few other things. But, anybody want to just discuss a little bit about this character here? That's John Brown, or at least that's a crazy drawing of John Brown.
Larger than life version of John Brown.
Larger than life. If we had time to go into the details, and like the movie said, the beard is straight out of the Bible. He's Moses.
Right. Yep. He's got a Bible in one hand, a rifle in the other, and he's ready to deliver some justice.
You can see he's stretched out like as though he's on a crucifix, like he's a martyr for the cause.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit. So John Brown, in 1854, 1855, he's an unknown guy for the most part. He's an ardent abolitionist. He believes slavery is evil. He wants to do everything he can to stop it. He and some of his sons go into Kansas. They murder some pro-slavery settlers there, pretty brutally, actually.
And does not get arrested or have any problems.
No, yeah, there's no consequences for what he does in Kansas. But really what John Brown's most known for is what happens about 5 years later in 1859. And that's when Brown he plans this raid on Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Today it's West Virginia, but back then it was just Virginia. And Harpers Ferry is, at the time, a very sizable federal arsenal, tons of guns that are there. It's at a place where I think it's the Shenandoah and Potomac Rivers meet. It was once kind of this thriving place because the powers of the river were there. But they come in there, and his plan is to go in there and seize all the guns at the federal arsenal. And hopefully word is going to spread out. He's going to start a slave uprising, and he's planning on freeing these slaves by force. But what ends up happening to Brown there at his raid?
Well, he has a pretty daring plan, and it just doesn't happen the way that he planned it. However, I would
Whatever
say
the plan was, I'm not sure, but yeah.
in the end, I think he got exactly what he wanted and maybe better than he had originally planned.
Yeah, because he becomes a martyr for
Right.
the abolitionists. You know, he is hailed by several as a hero who is willing to lay down his life to free the slaves.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the government hangs him. I mean, he
Yep.
is legally executed. However, most people in the North consider him a hero. So while he is hung as a traitor, he is actually being sung about in religious hymns.
Yeah, the book says Southerners were enraged, but on the day he was hanged, abolitionists tolled the bells and fired guns in his honor, like he had an honor guard at his death.
Yeah, I think, I oftentimes have students discuss, like, what do you think the reaction was in the North and the South? And I hate to just blanket everybody in the North to say that they liked him. Abraham Lincoln didn't think what John Brown did was right? I mean, there were a lot of people in the North who didn't think what John Brown did was right. I think there were some abolitionists who supported him, those ones who were like really dedicated to the cause. Certainly I think he was basically condemned in the South. But why do you think that Brown's actions, what he did there, I mean, this happens in October 1859. He's executed in December 1859. So this is just 1 year before the Civil War breaks out. Why do you think this is kind of like that last major thing, of event?
Well,
Why is this such a big deal?
We've skipped one item.
We're going to come back to a couple other things.
And I think that might help explain what happened here.
Okay.
But this is an act of desperation.
Yeah.
They have tried everything.
Yeah.
And he has one choice left in his mind, and that is a desperate act of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, and I think,
Legally,
again,
after the Dred Scott case, there are no legal attempts anymore.
Right. There's no more compromise after this case. This case seals it.
So yeah, we're just jumping on a little bit. The reason I put Brown there is because I thought Kansas-Nebraska Act of Brown was a good segue.
Right.
Let's come back and hit a couple other things. But yeah, you're right, Christian. I mean, the Dred Scott decision here in 1857, where you had this gentleman, Dred Scott. He was moved into free territory, I believe up into Wisconsin for a while. And there was a law there that said once free, always free. So when he's brought back down into Missouri, a slave state, he says, hey, I should be a free person. I lived in this free territory. You can't bring me back down here. He sues for his freedom. And the case gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court issues what I would argue is probably the worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. And it rules, there's a couple on the screen here, but, first of all, he basically says slaves are not people. They cannot be citizens. Slaves are property. So therefore, Mr. Scott, you have no reason for even being here. This is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, saying this, right? You have you can't do that. And the second piece of it is essentially saying that slavery must exist everywhere now, because the government doesn't have the right to prevent people from taking their property to other states. Therefore, all of these compromises, the Missouri Compromise and all this other stuff, are basically thrown out the window. And the Supreme Court saying that basically slavery must be allowed to exist everywhere.
Yep.
And, I think the Supreme Court thought, you know what, we weighed in on this, all done. And that's not the case at all, right, with the Dred Scott case. What are the reactions here with this?
What you see after this case, I mean, prior to this case, we've got everything going on in Kansas, right? Wasn't that the same year or right before, right near this, Bleeding Kansas? Yeah. So all the violence is way out there in the territory. Mm-hmm. Then this case happens, and John Brown's raid brings that violence home. Where he hits at Harpers Ferry, it's not just an arsenal, it's an arsenal right in the center of the country. So now we have violence hitting right within the center of where everybody lives, and it just escalates from there. I think that's just You know, that they've realized there is no other recourse. If we are going to stop slavery from spreading or from happening, it's going to have to be a fight.
Mhm.
Yep. And, we're almost done with our events. So we got 2 left. We'll have the Lincoln-Douglas debates, then the 1860 election. But if we go fast forward to the next year in 1858, then, guys, in 1858, Stephen Douglas, we've talked about, is running for re-election in 1858. And this up-and-comer with this brand new political party, the Republican Party. You've got Abraham Lincoln, who's running against Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, for the Illinois Senate seat. And as part of their kind of campaign of 1858, they agreed to a series of 7 different debates throughout the state of Illinois. You can kind of see them on the map there. And, the Dred Scott decision is one of the things that comes up in these debates.
Sure.
Why, here's the question I like to ask students. Why would some obscure set of Senate debates in Illinois in 1858 matter for the nation as a whole, or for the debate? Like, why does this matter? Like, why do the Lincoln-Douglas debates matter? What do you guys think?
I don't actually think they were as obscure as it might seem. I think they were heavily publicized
Sure.
and printed and sent among the other states, first of all, because Douglas was a national figure. He's the one who had proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So he was very famous and already in the public eye on the subject of slavery and expansion into the territories. And Lincoln is associated with this new Republican Party, and he's such a good speaker that I just think that they're blown away with how good these debates end up being.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Again, I think it comes down to personality. Lincoln is the right guy at the right time,
Mm-hmm.
and he perfectly fills that role of the voice, the rational voice against slavery. He's not John Brown. He's not preaching violence. He's just logical and emotional, but I think he says things that the moderate portion of America wants to hear.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, if you go through and read, and one of the assignments I put on Canvas was just some excerpts from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but Lincoln really couches the issue of slavery in the founding of our country. He really he describes slavery as evil. He describes it as incompatible with America. He describes it as that, his famous, house divided against itself cannot stand. It's a pretty prophetic.
That's a quote from the Bible. So
it
he's
is.
not just he's not just saying that this is evil. He's saying that God approves getting rid of slavery, that we've got to do what's morally right, And,
it's interesting because we talk about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and everybody knows who Abraham Lincoln is. Some people know who Stephen Douglas is. And Lincoln loses this election, right? He loses in 1858, and Stephen Douglas wins re-election. But for Lincoln, what this really does is these debates propel him into the national spotlight. He is a famous national figure now. His words about slavery have been reprinted in Southern slave states. So when Lincoln, and this will take us to our last point then, guys, when Lincoln gets the Republican nomination for president in 1860, and when he ultimately wins the election in 1860 here, you can see on the Electoral College map, this is really the final straw for Southern states here, kind of our last event. Why is it that, and you can see on here, you can look on the map, it's a very divided country. Lincoln sweeps all the northern states and the western states there. You can see, the Democratic Party splits into 2 here between Breckinridge and Douglas, who kind of split Northern and Southern Democrat. You have a kind of a compromise candidate with the Constitutional Union Party, but Lincoln wins the Electoral College, becomes president. Why is this the thing? Why is this the final event here? He gets elected in November 1860.
Well,
a month later, South Carolina's out.
Again, it's a long story, and it goes all the way back to the end of the last unit, which is California coming in as a territory. And the whole reason we fought the Mexican-American War, the South really believed that if they could win that land from Mexico, they could balance themselves with the northern free states. And they attempted these balances ever since the end of the war, all the way up as these states were added. But what they see when you look at that map is that it's over. That there is no compromise that will give them an advantage or even a balance from here on out. They have lost. They have lost in population, they've lost in territory, and there's no way for them forward, and so they bail.
And I think if you look at it, I think too, they saw Lincoln directly as a threat. I mean, we've looked at a lot of their ordinances of secession. A lot of the states point directly to the election of Abraham Lincoln as a threat to
Sure.
their way of life, their, everything. So it really is Lincoln's election. And, Lincoln goes on to make numerous statements saying that he's not going to touch slavery. He's not going to do all this stuff. But,
But everybody knows he's opposed to slavery.
Everybody knows he's morally opposed to slavery.
I think that nationwide, they've realized this is going to come down to a fight now. Like I said, there's already been fighting in Canvas. There's already this issue with John Brown. It's down to violence. The last,
I would argue it's less about Lincoln's words than about John Brown. You have to look at the year 1860. John Brown attacked Harpers Ferry in 1869. And 59, right. So it's fresh on their minds. They feel like they are under attack, that there are abolitionists behind every corner waiting to attack them. And when Lincoln wins, they realize that they'll never win the White House again.
Yeah.
They can't.
Well, we should point out that Lincoln wasn't even on the ballots in the southern states. He didn't even, those green states down there, he wasn't even.
Right.
They didn't even put his name on the ballot.
He wasn't even on those ballots. So it was, So anyway.
Yeah. You can look at the colors on the map. Even if you add the green, and the other colors, Lincoln still wins.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's hard to see here with, I don't know if I can move this out of the way. Can you guys see the electoral vote part and all that?
Lincoln is blue.
Right.
And even if you add every other color up, the blue still wins.
Right.
Right. The blue looks like a little bit less territory, but what we're looking at is the number underneath each state's name. Right. And those numbers tell us how many votes they got. So yeah, if you add all of those up, Lincoln wins no matter what.
Yep. Wins the electoral college. So that's it. I mean, and it's from this point, South Carolina secedes in 1860 or December 1860. And then by the time Lincoln's inaugurated in March of 1861, almost all of those states in the South have seceded and started to form the Confederate States of America. And it's off to war we go here. So,
yeah.
So, all right. Well, do you guys have anything else that you want to share before we say goodbye here?
No, I think it went well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, 8th graders, hope this was helpful for you. We'll post this on Canvas so you guys can review this as you're getting ready to take the CFA. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it.